I decided to look into when you take all the lore in the game, what Hoenn's history really is. And there's not many points. It's just like 1 or 2 points. But it says that, so Hoenn was created after Primal Groudon and Primal Kyogre were formed. What does that mean?
Formed.
Like they form like a mountain forms? Like why would you word it like that?
Formed.
So,
as if like a certain mutation took place and he was like created.
Exactly. That's the sense I get too. When they say it like that, it sounds like if you look at Heatran's Pokédex entry, they say he naturally formed from a volcano. Like he mutated out of lava. That's what it sounds like. But when it says Hoenn was created after Primal Groudon and Kyogre were formed, that means there is an empty just sea there. And then one day, for some reason, there's a Primal Groudon and a Primal Kyogre. So that's the first thing. So to me, obviously, this is like early in Game Freak's like world building and stuff. But now that we know they'll make Legends games, if they ever make like Pokemon Legends Rayquaza, they could really explain the lore and stuff. So to me, I want them to explain what they mean when Kyogre and Groudon just appeared one day. Because before they appeared, there's no Hoenn. So Groudon would have to make land and then Kyogre would have to have the seas go through it. And that's what makes Hoenn.
It's almost like there's a term, it's called Gagungagap. It's really dumb. The sound sounds funny, but basically in Norse mythology, right? The whole creation thing was there was like nothing, right? And then at one point there was one side that was called Niflheim, one side that was called Muspelheim, which was fire and like thing. And then
Fire and what?
Fire and like the equivalent of like almost like ice.
Okay.
Basically like they like there's like a meat and then like it created like the world, right? There's a similar parallel to this if you kind of look at Punk Hazard in One Piece, right? There's this place where it's almost like screwed up because of like the actions of this like thing. So I'm trying to think is if that's the kind of primal thing they'd be tapping to. If we go into a Legends game, right? Was there almost this like primordial fire and primordial like
they could be like,
and then they manifested, and then at that point
or something.
they materialize, and when they materialize in some weird way, they're like clashing, and then when they're clashing, Hoenn's being formed, right? It's almost like a deity. So these two deities are formed out of nowhere, and whether they're clashing or not, just in their creation is Hoenn being created. Then at some point, maybe they're getting too rowdy, right? So then the third deity just like regulates it, and then at that point, all three kind of disperse, never to be seen, and one goes to the
leaves behind Hoenn. The world is built,
and the world's built, and that's Hoenn.
Okay, see, that's pretty sick. To me, what I wanted to see when I read that they formed out of nowhere is to me, Kyogre and Groudon are so titanous that I want to normalize them almost. I feel like if I make them less magical, that they get cooler. What I want to happen is, for example, so they don't have to revisit Hoenn to continue telling its story. They can still tell it in other games. So imagine, right? Let's say you're playing a Gen 10 game and you meet this Pokemon in the game. It's like a pretty common Pokemon, this ugly looking, like normal fire type. And what you learn later on in the game, you catch it and you read its Pokédex stuff, but maybe you find a professor or just a researcher in a lab somewhere. What he says is that when he researches it, that it seems linked to the legendary Pokemon Groudon. And you also find it in this ugly fish that's in normal water. And it just barely looks like a whale. But you say this is linked to what they call Kyogre in Hoenn, right? But they're these weak common Pokemon. And what I want them to do is like show them as like distant relatives that split off from Kyogre and Groudon. So almost like Kyogre and Groudon, they didn't just form one day, but they're like these super mutants. So the two as Pokemon, maybe what they are like Pokemon that learn rain dance and stuff, and their whole species about the rain. And so what you would imagine is one day a super version of them exists that can just wield the rain and stuff. And they're just a troublemaker, so they go off. And that ends up becoming Kyogre. And then same thing for Groudon, right? That's almost what I want. I don't want it to be this primordial fire thing. I want it to actually be normalized.
So you want it to be closer kind of to like how Diancie became Diancie, because that was even like a mutation. So you're basically saying there has to be a Carbate Groudon.
Yeah, it wouldn't even be called Groudon. It might not even start with a G, but maybe you would see it's like this little humpback ugly thing, and it's completely ass. But it's just to show that Groudon and Kyogre didn't just appear out of nowhere. They're an actual species.
Yeah, you can even render it down to like the most like minuscule form, make it look like a Cosmog. Not necessarily in appearance and size. Like it's so
irrelevant. It would be like a small hedgehog.
It's so relevant. You're like, wait, Groudon came from this, and you're like, that's what happened in that primal era. Like some crazy amount of power found its way to these two, and they just became thing. Because the other question I have is, why are you two beefing?